Welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Hello, dear audience. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I hope you had a great week. And you can always find Let's Talk Micro on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Goodpods, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Let's Talk Micro. As for our social media, I am on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube as Let's Talk Micro, on LinkedIn as Luis Plaza, on X as Let's Talk Micro 1, and I have an email address which is letstalkmicro at outlook.com. So either via email or via social media, you can send out any feedback, any suggestions. Those are always welcome and appreciated. So please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and if the app allows you to do so, please go ahead and leave a review. Thank you so much for the support. As always, if you are looking to learn more about antibiotics, please check out www.learnantibiotics.com and the Learn Antibiotics book available on Amazon. These resources include cheat sheets, practice tests, games, and more, and they are being used by thousands of people worldwide and may be helpful for you or your colleagues. Great resources from Dr. Timothy Gauthier, a very passionate pharmacist. And as you know, the Let's Talk Micro podcast does not have any sponsors, so if you want to support the podcast in any way, you can do so via Venmo link or by buying a coffee KO-FI, both links available on the show notes. But thank you. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, please go ahead and do so. It was a great episode where I had two guests, two microbiologists from the CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and they joined the podcast to talk about the AR Isolate Bank. AR, which stands for Antimicrobial Resistance. And maybe those of you that might have been working on a project or a validation at some point in time, and you might have requested some organisms from the CDC, and you saw that the vials had the designation AR. So that's where those isolates come from. So in the podcast, they talk about what the AR isolate bank is, what type of organisms can you find, what was the purpose of creating this isolate bank. All in all, it was a great episode with some great content, so definitely check it out if you haven't already. Today's episode is a little bit longer than other episodes than normal, so I'm just going to be brief, but it's about an MLS program, Medical Laboratory Sciences program, that's located in the University of Alaska in Anchorage. So in the episode, I am joined by the program director, Grace Leu-Burke, which she also teaches microbiology. And she talks about the program, what kind of program it is. She talks about the microbiology curriculum and something very interesting that she has the students doing, which is research. And the research program, has a lot of information. So she's gonna come at some other point in the podcast to talk about it more in detail. But she talks about the samples, and they do susceptibility testing on the stool samples, and they look for things like antimicrobial resistance. All in all, great information, and I do love what Grace is doing with the students, and she's really preparing them, and the way that she's getting them to do critical thinking in microbiology and building a foundation with the organisms and biochemicals and susceptibilities. So I think that they come out well prepared, building that confidence, which is something very important that we need to have as medical laboratory scientists. In the episode, she also talks a little bit, she gives her story, as far as how she became an educator, what inspired her. I mean, she spent 35 years working as a medical laboratory scientist before she decided, to become an educator. So it's a great story. All in all, a great episode. Let's go ahead and listen to it. Well, listeners, as you know, from time to time, we, besides talking microbiology, and we're talking a little bit of microbiology today. Sometimes, we talked about different medical lab science programs. And recently, I was listening to a podcast called Off the Bench from the ACLS, and they had a guest, and she was talking about her program, and she was talking about the research the students do at their program, and I found it very interesting. So I reached out, and here we are. So with me today, I have Grace Leu-Burke from the University of Alaska Anchorage Medical Lab Sciences program. Grace, welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak, Louis. This has been exciting when I talk to the off the bench individuals, to not only to let people know what it's like to teach in Alaska, but to also, what medical laboratory science is. So many times people don't know what we do. I always tell my students that we send them the bill, but they don't know where it came from. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to other individuals in the greater wide world, and not only about Alaska, but about our field, microbiology and med lab science.
Yes, definitely. It's a profession that sometimes there's a lot of unawareness, and people kind of find out by the time they're done with their degrees and they come back. So as I said before in the podcast, sometimes typical presentation, we have students that they already have completed a degree and then they come back. So it's always good keep talking about MLS, and definitely shout out to the Off the Bench podcast and Sophia, which I had the pleasure of being a guest one point in time. So yeah, no, thank you again. So for the audience, can you tell them a little bit about what you do?
Sure. So, I'm a professor at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and I'm also the program chair here for our medical laboratory science program. But it's not like I went to college and woke up one day and decided I wanted to be a medical laboratory science educator. I tell my students that life is a process. And as long as you keep your options open, as long as you're always willing to learn something new, no matter what field you decide to go into, you will grow as a person and you'll grow in your field and you'll grow in your life. And so that's kind of what happened to me. In the very beginning, I went to South Dakota to become a medical laboratory scientist way back in the 70s and 80s when it was still a kind of field that was dominated by women. But the reason I went to the college is that it was also a place that I thought about, going to the convent. It was Mount Marty College was a Catholic university and it was a good school, had a good med lab science program. But also I was thinking, I might want to become a nun. Well, I'm married and I have children, and my husband always said he saved me from the convent. But my life didn't actually start out when I thought it was going to be. So I became a med lab scientist. I married a Swede Norwegian. So I wound up in Kansas. And in Kansas, I found a really great job as a medical laboratory bench technologist. But the interesting thing is that when I first came out of school, we were undergoing some changes in microbiology at the department of the hospital I was working at. And I still remember they said, "Great, new grad, we need to know all the new stuff." And so I was instrumental as a new grad to write the procedure manual for microbiology. And you have to remember, I wasn't really good at micro in my undergrad. And when it came to parasitology, I always said that if it didn't crawl across my field, I was never going to see it. And yet I had that opportunity. And so I took it way back there in the early, I'm 21 years old. And then I decided, well, I'll join ASM because they seem to know stuff. And so being given that responsibility and saying yes from the very beginning started my path always in micro. So although I was a generalist for my entire 35 years of medical laboratory science, I was always part of ASM. I was always part of micro. I was always learning new things. I was going to conferences. And in Kansas, we had the Southwest Association of Clinical Microbiologists was our ASM branch, SWACM, which I think is the best acronym there ever was. And that was the coolest, best group of individual microbiologists. And I'd go to their conferences. And it all started because when I came out of school, they asked me if I wanted to help write the procedure manual. And I said yes. So because of that and being part of ASM and, being part of ASCLS and ASCP, I did all those continuing education classes. I grew in micro and I grew with the lab. And when we started bringing molecular into the lab when I was in Kansas, I realized I wanted to know more than the salesmen, because, salesmen are salesmen, whether they're selling you a car or they're selling you a chemistry analyzer, they'll sell you anything. So I wanted to know more than the salesman. And Michigan State University started having this molecular diagnostics. And I discovered that the hospital would pay for some of this. And I'm like, well, this sounds kind of neat. I think I could do this. I'm, 40s, I'm not that young, but I think I could do this. Oh my gosh, I had no idea what online learning was. I hadn't been to school since, 1982. But I started and I really learned, and I learned how much I didn't know. And I got through everything. And then I went on campus because they had their lab, that they had their on campus lab that we did for a week. And I was the oldest person there, except for a couple of the professors. And everybody else was young people. And there was one instance, and it was to respect older technologists. There was one, and nobody wanted to be my lab assistant. I mean, they were nice young people, but let's face it, I was a 50-year-old woman. Nobody wanted to be with a 50-year-old woman. And I get that. But finally, I had a lab partner. We did okay. But one day we did an extraction, right? And we didn't extract the 40 microliters. We didn't have enough for 40 microliters. We had enough for a good 35 microliters to be accurate. So I'm redoing the calculation so that we can do it with 35 microliters. And she's all upset. And she goes to the TA and she goes, I knew it. She's messing this up. She's changing things. So, he comes over and says, what's going on, Grace? And I go, well, we don't have 40 microliters. We have 35 that are accurate. So I'm just changing it so that we can run it on 35 microliters. And he looked at her and he says, yes, Grace is old. And yes, Grace is a little bit slower on some things, but Grace knows lab math. So she knows her lab math. She knows she's doing it right, and it's fine. So I finished, and when I was there, at graduation, our little graduation, they said, you're a third of the way to your graduate degree from Michigan State, and they were starting their online hybrid, where I could take it online. And I thought, why not? And I talked to my husband, and he says, well, we just graduated our last kid from college, so I've been paying tuition all this time. What's another tuition? And I was working full time in the hospital to pay a portion of it. So I got my master's degree while I was working, and I was still working second shift, and I was doing homework and having a thesis and doing all this thing and growing in this knowledge. I still can't amaze how much I still didn't know. Molecular has changed so much in micro, and I thought I was going to be beneficial to the workplace. And I suppose that's the one thing that disappointed me, that even though I was a generalist working second shift, doing micro, doing blood bank, doing everything, and adding all this molecular piece, it just didn't get embraced like I thought it would. So I started doing some adjuncting. I liked it. I always volunteered in my kids' schools because I work second shift. So I just do little micro things for the high school, and I do some stuff in chemistry for the chemistry instructors there at the high school. So I'd been doing dabbling and teaching. And the one thing I did do when I was at Michigan State, because I could take electives, I took 2 electives in the education department, which was the smartest thing I did. One was, teaching and leading. So it's the idea of what does teaching as a leadership mean, and the philosophy of teaching and things like that. And then one was on teaching the non-traditional students. So in other words, teaching college age and those students that come back to college. And not only was it really a good way of understanding how teaching was, and how you take what you know and be able to present it for somebody to understand it, which I felt helped me on the bench just as much as it did later on when I became a teacher. But those instructors were the nicest people. I was the only graduate student that wasn't in the Department of Education. But they let me, they had an open seating. They let me come in as an elective. And they were the most supportive people I've ever been. Because sometimes in medicine, we can be a little Socratic. I mean, we can be a little bit mean, to be honest. Sometimes we're tough on our students, and we want them to be, we want them to excel. And so sometimes we don't always use that, that supportive type of aspect to it. And so being surrounded by educators and this group that were very extremely supportive about myself as my outcome really benefited me as a medical laboratory scientist, thinking of my outcome and the people I was supervising on the bench, their outcome, looking at it at a different way than as a scientist, where yes, you have to have it right. Yes, you have to have protocols followed. You need to have these student learning outcomes measured. We're going to measure you. We're going to assess you. But it was more of an academic, you know what I mean? More of a, how we are in medicine, like, analytical. And here, learning assessment and learning about teaching and reaching people, and not in a soft and fuzzy way as much as in a holistic method, that you as an individual, as a worker or a student, are a holistic person, and how you approach your outcome and how you can be a better person on the bench sometimes is a different set of skills. So it's wonderful classes I took. So I had some of those pieces together, and the University of Alaska Anchorage was looking for a microbiologist. They were looking for a tenure track, which at the time I didn't think I was foolish enough not to know that was really a tough position to get, that's tenure track. So it didn't occur to me not to apply for it. And I went ahead and applied. I had a really lousy second shift day at work. And so I logged off and I called my husband and I go, I think I'm going to apply for this. And he said, go for it. And so that was 2016. I was finishing my master's degree. I was graduating from Michigan State. I was still working full time. I was finishing up my final papers that I was doing. And I was interviewing for the job at UAA. And it was a process of both, written, and then we had a virtual, like this type of a Zoom that we are also familiar with now, but back then wasn't quite as familiar. And then they flew me up for a 2-day on-site interview for a couple of days, and then for us to look around, and then job offer. And so it was kind of a whirlwind, but it was a huge decision to then make that leap. So I tell my students that I graduated in May. went to Michigan State to get my diploma because my husband said we're going to walk. So we drove up to Michigan State and I walked with all the other students. And I'm very proud of my master's from Michigan State. Go green, go white. Very proud of that degree. And then I went back to Kansas, worked until 4th of July weekend because I was scheduled for 4th of July weekend. And they were like, well, Grace, you were supposed to do 4th of July weekend, so you can't leave until 4th of July weekend came off. To kind of tell you the work environment I had at the time. And so I worked 4th of July weekend, and then we packed up the truck on Monday and drove across Canada and went to Alaska. And then I started teaching August 1st of 2016 and haven't looked back. I will tell you, though, my husband was in charge of the move because I was doing a lot. He was retired, and he was in charge of the move. And at one point, I thought, oh, how do I get to Alaska? So I typed in, Salina, Kansas to Anchorage, Alaska. And I went out to the living room and I went, we have to drive through Canada to get to Alaska. Now, you have to realize I have a really bad sense of direction. Like, I always go the same way to stores so I don't get lost, even in my own town. So it's no surprise to any of our kids that mom doesn't know how to get to Alaska. But I really kind of had this idea in my head. And my husband goes, well, how do you think we're going to get up there? Of course, we have to go through Canada. And I go, I don't know, go to Seattle, take a right. And so everybody just laughs because if you ever look at it, it's a huge move. It's 3,000 some miles. It's over areas where there's only like one road. You go through the Yukon and the Canadian Rockies. I mean, you're only on one road. And if I had known that, I don't know that I would have been brave enough. But I didn't know that. And my life, I didn't know that, not because I didn't want to know, because I gave that responsibility to someone else, which I learned in my graduate classes that sometimes that's a good thing to do, that sometimes it's important to accept other people's skills and let them to do that. As medical laboratory scientists, we like to think that we control the world, but sometimes we have to let somebody else do something. And so, so I made my way to Alaska, and I've been here ever since.
Wow. So you definitely, you had a full career before you made this move. I mean, you worked many years in the bench and as you know, sometimes, being an educator, it's just not everyone can actually doesn't have the patience to do it, or sometimes, it requires you a lot of times, having an understanding and sitting there with the students, sometimes, being asked the same questions over and over again. And it just, everyone, even though you see this on the bench sometimes, when students are doing their clinicals, not all the techs, they have the patience for that. So anything else that led you or inspire you to do that change at that point? I mean, after working so many years?
Well, so I've always been a second shifter. So when you're a second shifter, you're always getting the new grads. I mean, we always got the new grads from Wichita State or, the travelers. I mean, the new grads always come on to second shift. And so I feel like I've always been in that role where I was trying to guide them, trying to help them to be the best medical laboratory scientists that they could be. Because even though they would come in with a set of skills, often, like any new grad, they needed guidance. And so I worked really hard to try to provide them with, so I always felt like I was always training, even when I wasn't a trainer on the bench. And I wanted them to do well because I wanted them to have confidence. Maybe because I wanted them to have the confidence that I had when I was a new grad and I was okay with writing a procedure manual for micro. I don't know why I had that kind of confidence, but I wanted to give those students and say, your education is good, and I'm going to give you this opportunity to build on that and to build on that confidence. So I think some of it, I've always sort of had that in my life all the time. And like I said, I've always would do, when they had the career days at school, can somebody come and do something? Since I work second shift, I always did that. I'd always go to the junior high and talk about med lab scientists, or I'd always work and maybe do a little demonstration for micro in the advanced, chemistry classes and blood micro classes and biology classes they would have at the high school. Some of the advanced placement classes, I would do some things. And so I always was sort of in that teaching mode. And I helped to raise 7 children. And so my kids were always excited when I got the teaching because they said, well, now I have somebody else who's going to feel your fingers on their back, Mom, because you always wanted us to do well. You always wanted us to have that education. You wanted us to grow, to learn. I mean, we're constantly wanting people to make that next step forward. I was such a person that wanted everyone to find the potential in themselves. Just how I am as a person is that we had a phlebotomist, and she was a really good phlebotomist, but I saw that she did a lot of really good literature reading. I'd see her reading, because we were downtime during the lab, and she was reading this book, and I'm like, have you ever thought about going to college? And no one had ever asked her that. She goes, well, I have a good job as a phlebotomist. I go, I know you do, but you have really good skills in reading, and you might want to just learn more. And, there's community college, and you work second shift, and you could just, get general education to start out with. But I think you should go to college. So to learn, to see what's out there. And there's more than just phlebotomy, and not just to be a medical laboratory scientist. I mean, it wasn't that. It's just that I could just see that she had more to grow. I said, there's more of you to grow. Well, she's a social worker now, and she got her master's in social work. And she still emails me occasionally. And she'll say, Grace, you took that minute. So I still remember they took that minute. We were busy. You were busy. And you noticed me. And you noticed me, and you noticed that I had something in me that I didn't even recognize in myself. And so I think I've always been that kind of person. And it doesn't mean I'm a super person. It's just my personality. And so I think maybe that's the transition to teaching was not an easy transition, but one that when the opportunity came, I thought that I might like it. Now, to say that I was this easygoing, not type A laboratory professional, so my kids never knew that I could swear until one time they came to see me in the lab, and I came in and somebody had not ordered stuff, and my blood bank refrigerator did not have enough O's, and I was really pissed off. And I'm a blood banker. I'm a scientist. It's stat. We need to get stuff. We need to get it done. Need to get done. Need to get done right. And so that's still there. And so that was probably the biggest transition, like you said, is I had to remember to meet the students where they were at, and then build them up to that skill set. Because I have students that will come into micro that have never used a flame, have never used a loop, that have never labeled the plate. And so it's one of those things where you need to make sure that you're breaking down your task so that they have things that will build onto themselves, and then make sure that they know the expectation that once they're taught that task, that then they're going to need to learn the next task will build on top of it. So it's not that everything is dumbed down, but it's placed at a level that they can develop confidence and competency and then move on to the next. I think sometimes the anxiety that our medical laboratory scientists have on the bench is that they have somebody come in and they don't have that type of background, and they don't know quite at that point how to break it down so that that student builds confidence. So they learn something and maybe they learn it wrong, and then they feel bad, and they might even get not necessarily yelled at, but that stern talking that we all know how to do on the bench. And then they get scared to do the next task. So as an educator, and something that partly I learned from taking those education courses I took in Michigan State. I will tell any individual that listens to this podcast that thinks at some time, I just think it was the best classes I took. Even if you are planning on never leaving the bench, but you're getting your master's degree in leadership, or you're going to be a manager and you're getting your MBA. If you have an opportunity to take an education graduate level course in things like leadership and learning, or like I said, the non-traditional student, anything along those lines, do it. Because some of the things that I learned about how to approach and how to establish a goal and how to reach that goal, and recognize that individuals have different ways to reach that goal, made me the instructor that I am. And again, shout out to Michigan State for letting me do that, because that also helped. My natural tendency to want to bring people up to their best potential, experience with having had a lot of young students come out of med lab science schools, seeing kind of the gaps in their education, where if I was going to be an educator, maybe what I want them to have. And one of the things is that confidence that they're going to be dealing with patient samples and not just a mock-up. And that leap is kind of hard to make. So seeing that gap, that how I wanted to approach that, and then, just learning to break things down and remembering to slow down. And that was that first semester. I always still feel sorry for those students that first semester, because not only did I have to learn how to slow down, teaching a skill, I talk really fast, and I talk fast now, but I talked even faster then. So those things, but it became like, I miss the bench. There are days that I'm looking at slides with the students and I'm helping them in parasitology and I'm humming a little bit because I'm trying to find that Entamoeba coli. And I'm like, gosh, I miss this. I mean, I miss that. I do. I miss my bench where it's quiet and I got all the stools I'm doing because I like doing O&Ps, which in itself is kind of weird, but I do miss that. But it's so important for us to also reach students that part of me that wants people to grow and to do the best they can also made me I think a good educator, and is why I'm happy with the job I have. So individuals, when they make that leap, again, it's a different skill set than when you're just even teaching somebody how to run the new Beckman analyzer and what the F function means this time. And we have this new software upgrade. That takes some task. But when you're having somebody with no idea how to do something, a new student that comes on the bench, new grad that comes on the bench, how you approach them has to be not only the task, but also that soft skill as how are they approaching it themselves. So what do they bring that is strong and what do they bring that is weak? Are they, is their personality high? I'm here. Can you teach me how to do this? Or is their personality like they're not even opening their mouth? And that really, you have to change to some extent how you approach them when you're going to teach that task. So that's, yeah. So for me, the transition was maybe easier than others. I like to say I was doing it my entire life. But at the same time, yeah, it's always a challenge. But I think to some extent, it's no different than when you have someone with a PhD in chemistry and all of a sudden he's teaching chemistry. How many of us that are listening has had that chemistry, biology, math professor that had no idea how to teach, right? That just, you were just lucky that you caught a good TA that helped you out. So that I think is the nature of university training in a nutshell anyways.
Yes, definitely. We do get our, yeah. At some point in time, we all had that one class or that where the other professor. It's difficult, and maybe doing the assignments or other things, it helps you at the end get a good grade because than that, it just, it's challenging. I like how you said, yeah, just with taking the time and understanding and yeah, we had some challenges, especially when COVID, that we had some students that took their microbiology class online. So when they came in, they had to get their microbiology, their microscopy skills. So we had to even take that step back further and say, okay, get them comfortable with just handling the microscope because they just took an online class. So it's definitely we have to, yeah, understand and then well, as you said, have them, build that confidence, which is very important to the work that we do, in all the areas. But in micro, if you don't have confidence, and it can be a really long day because it tends to be very gray. You have all those organisms growing on a plate, so you have to get to that point where you're comfortable enough seeing these things in and out and make the appropriate decision, which there's a human being behind that.
When you say that about confidence, and I don't want to break in, but you're right, because some students have it, and you as a microbiologist, the Staph aureus is the one that's coagulase positive, right? And so I'll be even in lecture class, I go, okay, we're going to run a coagulase, and the coagulase is positive. So what is our organism? And they sort of like Staph aureus. I go, no, say it again. They go, and then they're a little bit loud. I go, no, say it with conviction. Like you're at a football game. What is this? And they go, Staph aureus. I go, yes, it's Staph aureus. And because you have to do that, I go, guys, you got to be that confident. So again, catalase positive, coagulase positive, it is. And then they shout out Staph aureus. I go, that's exactly right. And so, because you're right, they don't want to be wrong. And in micro, you're at some point, the rubber hits the road. And then I tell my students too, but then there's always that nice words, presumptive, potential. I mean, so sometimes when you're not quite sure, there's always terms you can say if you're not quite certain, but you're right. Micro, it's not like chemistry where it's going to spit out an answer and then you got, oh, my QC worked, everything worked, I can report this out. In micro, sometimes your QC worked and it says, you're doing a slide coagulase test or you're doing a latex test, which can have some nasty cross reactivity if you're not careful. And it doesn't really look positive, but it's kind of grainy. And then you look, and then you got to think, what do I have? And then that's where that critical thinking comes into play. And then your confidence, looks like a duck, acts like a duck, is probably a duck. Or, this doesn't really look like a Staph aureus on the plate. Maybe I need to do something different. So, yeah.
Yeah, you definitely build a good knowledge of what's normal, and then at the same time, as you build that confidence, you're like, okay, I have to take a step back and maybe pursue this one further down and do more testing. A lot of atypical presentations, definitely. So let's go ahead and talk about the MLS program. As the audience knows, and we have talked about this before, we have all sorts of programs, where you have like a combination, and we call them like the 2+2, 4+1, where they take some years with some requirements, and then they do the actual program. So what kind of program is the MLS program at UAA?
So I like to think of our program as a traditional 4-year program. Our students, their first freshman year, if you come in and declared as an MLS major, you actually come in and declare the major as a freshman. And you take some prerequisite classes, a couple chemistry classes, a couple biology classes, and then you start right away your second year in what we call our MLS and MLT program, and we start with our 100 levels. And then we actually start them right at phlebotomy, and we do laboratory techniques and serology. And the reason we do this is as we're building on, we have what's called an articulated program. So say we have students declared an MLS, they got their GPA is there, they do their application, they're in our cohort, they're going to start our program. And then they do their phlebotomy, the courses we have that first semester, and then life gets in the way. They've been to school a year and a half, maybe family happens, maybe finances happen. And we say, well, that's okay. We have a internship you can take, and then you can get your phlebotomy and you can sit for the ASCP and you can be a phlebotomist, which is great. They have that right away. They have that. We actually designed our classes. They have that. And we actually do that as an occupational educational certificate. So we have a mixture of our MLT, MLS students, but also some students that are just getting their phlebotomy. So, but let's say they move on. And so then the second classes, the second series of classes they take are all our 200 level classes. And now all MLT and MLS students take those. What's nice about that, along with their general education classes, is the prerequisite classes we have for MLT are the same as MLS. So in other words, if they decide as they're doing this MLT, they think they're only going to do a 2-year program, they're like, wow, I'm really good at this. I'm smarter than I think I am. I really want to get my bachelor's degree. They just keep going. There's no reapplication. There's no different prerequisite they have to get. They have to take other courses for their Bachelor of Science. We have an ethics class they have to take. They've got other things that they have to take for the university, but there's time in the curriculum. There's time in their credits to be able to do that. But if they don't, they can get their MLT then after that second year plus their internship. So the MLT almost takes 3 years. Reason being is that they have a year of prerequisites, and then they take that phlebotomy semester, and then they have a year of 200 levels. But we do that because it allows students, and this became really great during COVID, to at each point in this path to getting an MLS can stop if they need to, and then be able to get a degree or leave the university with something. So even students, sometimes they think they're going to be an MLS, but sometimes they struggle. We don't have the easiest major. And because of that, we say, well, why don't you finish your MLT, work in the field for a while? Because with our program, you just come back in. And in fact, students that have been in our MLT program, assuming they get their prereqs done for their Bachelor of Science for UAA, it's only 3 semesters then to get their Bachelor of Science. So often students will get their associate's degree, then continue while they're working to pick up some of the other humanities classes that they need for their Bachelor of Science for UAA. And then they come back, and we have just 3 semesters they take. So they'll start in the September, so fall, spring, and then a summer rotation. So it's a 12-month, and then they have their MLS. And we have a lot of our upper division classes are taught what we call synchronous I-line. So it actually works with their work schedule. But if you don't, and you keep going, then you finish up. And so I always say we're 4 years in a summer because we have 2 full semester clinical rotations. One of the strengths in our program, I think, is we have very strong clinical rotations that are not as, or potentially better than what they could get in other facilities. They have full rotations in micro. They have full rotations in blood bank, besides core lab and all those other areas. And that makes such good graduates. They truly have a strong background before then they work in the clinical lab. So they do, so it's 4 years. And then because we have 2 semesters of rotation, their second semester is in the summer. So they have a August graduation is what they graduate in August. So that I would say 4 years and a summer.
So when this position about Alaska, right, maybe not, wouldn't be the primary choice a lot of times, that people think of it, okay, I'm going to take this opportunity in Alaska. And I know that you have worked many years and things like that. So was that like something that you saw that open at the time, or why Alaska's, I don't know, specifically, I guess, out of curiosity?
So, like, I don't know. I was always looking for jobs. I think my dad did when we were growing up. Dad was always looking for the next job, even though he never ever left a job. He always looked for the next job. So I'm always looking for the next job. And when I was looking at teaching, I started looking for other, programs. In fact, I applied for a program, I think, at the University of Illinois. So I was, it just was already kind of looking. And when you do that, you get on listservs. I mean, you just your email sort of. And I have a LinkedIn account and stuff. And so it happened to come into my email. Is what happened. I got an email link from, and it listed it. And so I thought, and then I was curious. And then Alaska, I did have my husband did have a friend of his from high school that was a mining engineer, and then went up there, and that's where he lived. And he always told Jerry, "You need to come up, and you need to go fishing." And so he had gone a couple years before I even applied for this. But I still remember when he came back, when I applied, I didn't know if he had gone to Fairbanks or Anchorage because I couldn't remember. I just remember I sent him up to go salmon fishing. And so we did have that one connection, which did help. I mean, that to some extent that did help, because not that they necessarily helped us in the move so much, but it is helpful on such a big move to have, because it's so far away, to have somebody up there that you kind of know. So that's where, but I don't know that I would have not applied for it, even with that, because like I said, I applied for jobs in Illinois and Indiana, and we didn't have any family in there. But I just remembered that. And the other thing about Alaska is that when I got up there, and we flew in April, and there's still snow in April, and Alaska, Anchorage is just different. I mean, I still say that they plan things like, let's build a building here and then we'll build a road to it. I mean, when you come from the cities, you're used to infrastructure and more than just one road. There's just not as much of that up there, which I find very fine. But at the time, it was a little disconcerting. But I remember walking on the campus and seeing just this wonderful campus, this beautiful lab, these students, this opportunity to really grow, not only, and I wanted to do research. And then that's when I interviewed. I wanted to start a research program in the curriculum, because when I would see students come in that were new grads, they just weren't curious about why an instrument was doing an thing. I mean, like I said, remember, I went back to grad school because I wanted to know all about molecular, because I didn't get it in college, and I needed to know this because these instruments were coming. And I didn't see that curiosity, and I thought, well, maybe if they did research, maybe, if they did some outcome-based research, because I'd been doing outcome-based research, the whole time I worked the bench. I was always asking, why the heck am I doing this test? Or I'd say, why are we setting up all these cultures? Isn't there a better way? Back to my whole personality, I want everything to be better, right? Things could be better. And I didn't see that. And I wondered if maybe because I had an opportunity to do research when I was an undergrad way back in the dark ages, and a lot of med lab science programs, at least what I saw them coming out, they had really good education. There's nothing wrong with it. But when I'd ask about what research they got to do, it was always like a capstone lit project, or, not that that's bad, but it was, or a case study, but it wasn't anything that they actually did on the bench where a cause and effect. And I thought, well, there's got to be something we can do in micro. There's got to be something I can do to create a research within the curriculum, so that the students would do something, that everything wasn't just mock-up lab and then they go to the hospital, and so all they know about the hospital is just bench work. And so the idea that research came to develop this bench work type of medicine, there was a gap there. There was a real gap. And part of it was our education. When I was going through med lab science, we were actually learning the latest thing coming out. That's why when I was hired, when they asked me, oh, you all know the new stuff, I want you to help us write the procedure manual. It wasn't because I was this super smart student coming out. It's because education was actually that way. We were learning the latest stuff that was coming out when they didn't know it. And we were doing research to help develop the latest stuff that was coming out. Now, of course, medicine and manufacturing's all changed since then. And I mean, we used to reprogram the computer boards and we'd get a new software. I mean, when we get a new kit, like CPK, and it was a brand new thing on my analyzer, I would have to pull out the board and rewire the wires. They would give us the electrical schematics to unbundle and bundle the keyboard of the big computer keyboard, because I'm putting on total billies now that I didn't run before on this instrument. So that's how basic instrumentation was when I was in school and when I got out. Can you imagine telling students when they finish that they're going to have to reprogram computer boards? They just didn't. But the expectation that we'd have to do that was there because that's what we had. So I wanted to do that. I wanted to create an idea of research. And so when I made that leap to Alaska, and when I went up there and I talked to them, the reason I went, because even at the time, we thought, first of all, I didn't think they'd hire me because I was too old. I was 55. Who hires somebody 55 for a tenure track position? Nobody does. Nobody does. And so I didn't think I was even, I knew I was one of several candidates. So we figured it'd be an opportunity to see Alaska, see his brother's friend, my husband's friend, to just, and see and maybe, who knows, right? Throw it against the wall, see if it sticks, right? So we went up there, and then when I saw it and I told them what I wanted to do, and I wanted to create this, and you have a lab, you have a facility, and we can make this phenomenal research-driven program. And when they said, we want you, then how could I say no, right?
I mean, I'm going to ask about the research in a minute, but before that, I just wanted to always, like to ask when I have the chance to talk to instructors that teach microbiology. So as part of your curriculum, can you maybe talk a little bit about the type of testing that you do? I know that I heard that on the other podcast that you mentioned that there is like a Vitex, so you do some sort of perhaps some susceptibility testing.
So yeah, again, one of the reasons when I walked into the lab and I saw industry level incubators, I mean, the best temperature controlled incubators you could imagine. They were not CO2. I mean, we use candle jars, which actually works very well, by the way. But you know what I mean? High quality, where I can make sure that my temperatures were constant, which as a microbiologist and a research microbiologist is really necessary. And at the time I came, they had a Vitec compact too. So I knew I could do antimicrobial susceptibility testing, being I'd get breakpoints. Now, granted, it was old, but at least I had the equipment there. So when I came onto the campus, one of the things that I was asked to do was to redesign the microbiology courses. The previous instructor was a good instructor, but their test scores were not doing as well, and there was concerns from the advisory board, things that happen. I mean, and that's in teaching all the time. It doesn't hurt to have new curriculum come in. It doesn't really reflect the instructor. Sometimes it's just time, And again, one of the things that I found when I'd have students that would come in, new grads on second shift, their inability to make the leap between a sample that is just something I'm getting tested on and a sample that you're actually going to have to report on this, and your initials are going to go behind it, and do you have confidence to do that? So I redesigned micro to be more of a systems approach teaching, where after they learned all of their basic staph, strep, E. coli, gram negatives, then we applied to them. So it's not always going to be staph week. It's not always going to be strep week. And in fact, when I would have teaching staphylococcus, in micro and lecture, and then we'd have staph in lab, and then your typical coagulase, you grow it on a plate, you do catalase tests, all those spot tests, and we'd learn on, and we'd start with disc diffusion. So we didn't wait for antimicrobial susceptibility until we got to antimicrobial susceptibility way back when. I actually, once we learned it was staph, and then staph was a wound infection, then the last lab was that we actually had a wound infection that grew staph, and that you had to identify it, you had to report it out, and then you had to do antimicrobial susceptibility testing. And then we did a chromograph for MRSA. So all of a sudden, the lab is not just demonstration. My lab is now that this is a wound infection. Most common wound infections is Staph aureus. We have to be concerned about MRSA. And that because I didn't want that whole huge diffusion, all we did was, we did cefoxitin, we did an oxacillin, we did a nafcillin. And then we did an MRSA plate. And then we talked about, how did we once do the diffusion for them? And so all of a sudden MRSA makes a whole lot more sense, in an ampicillin disc, because we're using the antibiotics, but not like a full AST. So as you're building on that, by the time we got to antimicrobial susceptibility testing and we're running the BITEC and we're doing breakpoints, they've been doing disc diffusion and understanding susceptibility in an organic way in MRSA on their third, fourth week of lab. And so that's what I do. And so we teach both 200 level and a 300 level micro. So the 200 level is that way. They never get more than one patient culture in that week or that couple of weeks. We get to the point where they know how to identify it. They're either doing, and then when it comes to the gram negatives, I make them know all of those slants. I know there's like, well, we have MALDI now, right? And we have BITEC, and why do they have to know all that? I go, because MALDI is usually right, but if it's not in the library, it ain't going to give you an answer. BITEC isn't always correct. I mean, you have to be careful. You got to know what it looks like. And sometimes it's really powerful when you see a lactose fermenter and it's indol positive and it's PYR negative. What the heck is it going to be? But all it's going to be is E. coli. You don't really need to run it on that BITEC. I mean, that's power. Knowing those biochemicals is power. Knowing that if something doesn't look right, and you can run a TSI slant and a urease and a citrate, and you got a pretty good idea at least what's major classification it is, that is power. The minute we decide that the molecular or the MALDI is going to dictate it, and we don't think about that, we're going to really lose a sense of there's another way to know what this is. And that also is very good and another method. And it might not give us an exact genus and species, but it might even get us better than whatever our instrument's doing, because our instrument's not, we just don't want to. In micro, you just can't. Plus, there are new bugs all the time. I mean, just because BioMaroa has decided this is going to be on the ID panel doesn't mean that there isn't something new coming down the pike, right? And if we are relying on only the library we're getting from whatever our MALDI is, then we can't. And if we don't have biochemicals, we have no way of saying, what could this be? And if students aren't comfortable with biochemicals, and slants are not hard to do, and they're not expensive. I make my own slants, and they have power. That gives them power because they think of that microorganism as a living being. So we do that, and then like I said, then we move forward once they have all of that, and then they have identifications, and then they start doing a little bit by the end with what are called standard operating procedures, with how do you actually report this out. So we're moving away from just staph is catalase positive, coagulase, all that. Strep is Lancefield typing, to I have a baby and it's a neonate, it's a positive blood culture. What are my usual suspects? What are my usual suspects, guys? And even before they even look at that plate, I ask my class, what are my usual suspects? And then they usually, by that time, they'll say, well, Staph aureus is always there. Yeah, it's always there. But, because baby's got to come from infection from somewhere, right? It's going to come from mom, right? There's no spontaneous blood infections. I always say that. There's no spontaneous blood infections coming from somewhere. So it comes from mom. So Staph's always there. E. coli is always there. Urinary tract infection. And of course, group B strep. And if you look at anybody's SOPs, that's the top three. Yes, there's Haemophilus, there's Neisseria, but when you talk about the top three, and then there's always Listeria is number 4, and it's really cool when you've had students that have been doing micro, and this is the end of the semester, that they're already thinking that way, right? It's not that, we don't have to think about staph, because staph was in the beginning of the semester. We're still thinking about staph, even though we're at the end of the semester, we're talking about antimicrobial susceptibility testing, because that's what we're finally doing. But now, our antimicrobial susceptibility testing is only adding to what's my usual suspects, what's my SOP, what's going to be analyzed, why are we doing it? It's a pure culture. It's on a blood culture. We do ASTs on all blood cultures because every blood culture, for the most part, is considered pathogenic. And they know that. And that's because it built from the very beginning. But if all we do is staph week in the September and October, and then we don't talk about it again until the final exam, then they have no concept that staph is not just staph week, but staph comes everywhere. And I'm even tricky enough that in the middle of the semester, when we're doing gram negatives, I'll give them a culture that's got staph on it. Easy Staph aureus. I'm like, what do you do, guys? It's gram positive, catalase positive, coagulase. You guys know this. And then that reinforces that, and I'll do that. And then our second semester was completely redesigned in lab, and everything builds on. So lecture is all application. Everything is systems. I teach the renal system. So we talk about the renal system and all the infections and all the things that occur with this, cardiovascular systems, respiratory systems. So it's not rebooting everything, but we're talking about systems. The only difference is we add all some of those other weird organisms that we don't necessarily, that we've not talked about in the 200 level, which is also our MLT level micro. So, more things on, we hit bordetella pertussis harder. We're going to hit Francisella tularemia. We're going to hit some of those things that they're still going to see, but what's nice is that everything else is so solid in a clinical setting that when I'm adding these things lecture wise, because you're not going to want to isolate those things in the clinical in your student lab. I'm a strong believer that your student lab needs to be safe. There is no way. I don't even isolate salmonella because there's no reason to. You can identify it, you can understand it. If they understand how things are and what they look like virtually, I mean, when that's going to grow. And the way molecular is doing with most of our stools, most of the time you're going to grow salmonella. It's going to be on a blood culture because it's going to be a septic salmonella. They're going to see it on blood culture. There's no reason to grow it in a student lab and to expose students to that. That's my personal opinion. But the concept of that, it's an additional pathogen they have, grows because they have all the spaces. And then lab, instead of more demonstration, is actually they come in and they have patient samples. So they'll have staph, they'll strep, they'll have gram negatives, and then they have to completely follow an SOP. So they have to go in and they got a urine culture and it comes in and it's a cath, what sample, what plates are you setting up? And there's a chart and they have to go in just like a regular lab. What is your protocol? And I talk about protocols because protocols are different from every micro lab to another micro lab. Now, protocols are in all departments, but micro in a teaching setting, I can teach protocol in a teaching setting in micro easier than chemistry or anything else because I can make it like a micro bench. I can make them look up and say that you're going to set, even if the physician forgot to set up an anaerobe or order an anaerobe on a fluid culture coming from surgery, your SOP says you do routine, anaerobe, and fungal, right? Because that's what a micro be. And then you got to call the floor and say, don't you know, you got to order these, or depending on your SOP of your hospital, you may have power to order those. Because I don't want my students to work their first day prep in a lab when there's even students and having a tissue come up and they only have a routine culture ordered, not to say, this is from surgery, shouldn't we be doing anaerobes, might be fungal. I want them thinking already that setup process, because if you set up wrong, you're wrong 3 days later. And if it's a tissue from surgery, you're really wrong. And so that's what advance is. Advance isn't let's try to isolate some weird organism and idea. No, that's what lecture is. Advanced is how do I run a micro lab? How do I make certain that I'm identifying everything correctly and I'm setting up correctly and I'm following the SOP correctly so that what's getting reported out is appropriate. And the students don't know this, but 2/3 during the labs that we have, all of a sudden they get somebody else's plates that week. So they've set everything up on that because we have 3 days of lab and it follows each other. They're doing their setups on Monday. And then they come in on Tuesday and they're sitting at somebody else's bench because I give them a different bench assignment. And then they got somebody else's stuff. And boy, handwriting becomes really critical. And then it's like, then they're like, well, and then they have to be like, they're the supervisor. Well, what are you going to do? I mean, that person's off skiing. You can't even call them. So how are you going to set this up? What's the error? And so it really, the eye-opening about the fact that you're not going to be the person. In fact, more than likely, if you're working micro, you're not going to look at the stuff that got set up because night shift set it up. I will have a plate that's in process where night shift did the gram stain and they set up the plates. And it's obviously a E. coli on the plate, but I don't let them use McConkey agar because I make them so they know it. And this is advanced, guys. This is advanced, right? But the gram says the gram-positive cocci. The gram stain that was reported out says gram-positive cocci. And you look at this big gray color. There's no way this is staph. But if they do a catalase on it, it comes catalase positive. And if they do a coagulase, I'm like, do you really think that's coagulase negative staph? Do you really trust night shift? I mean, I do that to them. I go, do you really trust night shift? Do you maybe should have re-gram stain that? Does it really look like a staph? So that really makes them think. And that's what advanced is. And that's all advanced. We do that from, January when we start until just before spring break. then we have spring break, and then we do our research cultures. We do some research cultures in there, part of our stool stuff. And then we have, because our stool stuff that we do and our research that we do is separate. So everything else that we do for our, like what I call our patient workups. So the first, before up until spring break, our meats and potatoes are your, wound cultures, your throat cultures, your respiratory cultures, your staph, your streps, your nothing enteric pathogens. I do that for two reasons. One, because I really want them to know these. I mean, this is urine cultures. That's the meat and potatoes of micro. Positive blood cultures. That's what I want them to feel really confident on. But also because depending on where you're at, a lot of stool stuff is being done molecularly, or they're getting sent out. And so so what I do then is to teach the molecular, or to teach the enteric pathogen piece. That's where my research comes in, Louis. And so what we do is that we actually have cultures that are stool samples that we collect on the ground. We do environmental collecting of both geese, moose, and bear. And we actually do all the testing on them as normal, except we do enteric pathogens. So the students will set them up on all the plates that we need to, and then including HE, XLD, and then we do a sugar toxin induction broth. We do a selenite induction broth. We do the whole 9 yards, campy, the whole thing. But then I also have them, when they get the macaque plate, they also have to isolate every gram negative, because we're also looking at gram negative identification and sensitivity. So what's great about that in advance is that's when we grow things like Hafnia, and we grow things like Aeromonas. We'll grow Yersinia. We actually grow a lot of Yersinia. We will also grow Pseudomonas fluorescens. And so remember all those unusual organisms that people are trying to grow on mock-up? We don't have to mock those up because students are growing them. They will actually have things that are, we always say oxidase, non-lactose fermenter or oxidase positive is going to be a non-Enterobacteriaceae. Well, you've got some funky things out there, where the oxidase isn't really all that cause and effect. So then they have to set up a TSI slant. Well, then they're like, oh, obviously we're not fermenting glucose. So, all of a sudden those things, come into play. All of that stuff they've learned, all the reasons why we have slants, that we do that. The concept of a non-Enterobacteriaceae is basically glucose fermentation. It has really nothing to do with oxidase as much. And so that becomes to play. And not because I mock something up, but because we grow weird gram negatives out of stool cultures that are coming from environmental areas. And so they'll do that, and then they'll run all the antimicrobial susceptibilities both on DISC and on the VITEC. They'll do ESBL screenings, because we screen for ESBL. So all of those advanced things on AST are done then. So so we do about 4 weeks of that. And then we also do the gram positive. So that's not part of enteric pathogens, but they also grow all the gram positives. So we get a lot of things like Enterococcus galerium, Enterococcus fecalis, and Faecium also, but Galerium cassiflavus. So their idea and their concept of Bank A and Bank B and Bank C and acquired and intrinsic and antimicrobial susceptibility really comes into play with that, because we're growing it and we're seeing it. So when we talk about, when we're growing, when we have an Enterococcus galerium and it's vancomycin resistant, they're like, oh, well, yeah, that's not acquired, that's intrinsic. And to see, students that have not even left my school, university, all of a sudden know, well, of course, it's Bank C, it's not Bank A and Bank B, so obviously it's intrinsic. And they understand that because we're doing research, and they know they have to get that right. And that's the other thing. By that time, they have the confidence, because I trusting them to identify these gram negatives, right? I mean, I go back and I verify a lot of stuff. That's why I do it during spring break. That's why I don't get a spring break. But they are doing the original. I mean, they want to be right? And so the concept that this culture means something, they make that leap, and they really take it seriously. And so we do that for about 4 weeks before and after spring break. And then we clean up with all the usual management and things like that. And virology, I do some fungal plates. I start growing fungi over spring break. And so they have fungi to look at. And we do have a biosafety level 2 cabinet that they can work in. But when we do the management stuff, the really cool thing about the management stuff is, the antibiotic ambiogram that they do, and when you have to do the IQPC, piece, they actually do that in all the data that they did when they were running patient samples. They've been running patient samples for, 8-9 weeks. And so they've got how many urines. And so I make them ask, they do all the statistics that you do. How many urines did you run? How many throats did you run? How many positive MRSAs did you run? And then they also have to go in and find something that they made a mistake on, and actually act like a manager and say, okay, so this is your error. What would you do if you're management? I mean, that's that whole, quality assurance, quality control. What outcome happened? What was a problem? What happened to that patient? had you not run that AST correctly, or that you missed that identification, or you decided that you weren't going to regram stain that blood culture, and now you reported out a staph epidermidis to something that was E. coli. I mean, what's the outcome to that? And so it really makes them think about that. And then we do quality, every day they come in, they have to take temperatures. Every day I make them take temperatures, just like they're working in a regular lab. They got to take the refrigerator temperature, freezer temperature, and they have to do that. And they average that at the, like you're supposed to. You know how you have to have that at your statistics that you do? I make them average. I make them see if there's any outliers, so all the stats that you do for other things, I make them do that. I mean, so they have to do a media check. They have to check that all the things, if you're having any kind of a CAP survey or whatever, an inspection comes in. Are you cleaning your bench every day? I make them check that they've cleaned their bench every day. They have a regular sheet they've got to fill out, just like they're working a regular bench. It was so great. I had one student that did a clinical rotation, and she automatically started taking temperatures. She was at a smaller hospital. And they felt so bad after she left, because now they're going to take temperatures again, because every morning she'd come in and she'd take temperatures, because that's what you do in the lab. But she was so used to doing it in my micro class that it didn't occur to her not to ask. I always tell the students to go ask before you do something, but you can ask them. You know how to take temperatures. They've been taking temperatures all semester. They know how to read a thermometer. They know how to read the outside temperature and the inside temperature. So they've been doing it all semester long, right? Because I make them do that in micro. Not that micro always has it that way, but that way they know that sometimes there is an external thermometer and an internal thermometer. So I actually do that. I have one of my refrigerators has an external thermometer, so I put one internally. So they're used to having two, and every day they do that, and that rote memory is there. And so, yeah, because usually blood bank has that, but of course we're not going to have a blood bank refrigerator, right? So we're not going to have that capability. So that's why I do it in micro, even though it's a little overkill in micro, but it gets them used to looking at that. So anyways, that's my labs.
Wow, that is wonderful. And I just want to ask, I'm not going to take too much more of your time, but as far as based on the research, so from what I was listening to the podcast, right? So they're collecting samples from was it from moose, right? And that's what they're using to set up they're doing the test on.
So yeah, and I didn't know how much of the research, because it's a whole another topic. And if you ever want me to come back again, we'll talk about it. So in Anchorage, we have what we call urban wildlife, and it's something that is really a part of our life. So we have about 15 to 1,600 urban moose that are in the Anchorage Bowl area. We are surrounded by the Chugach Mountains. So they come down. They learned that they don't like to stand in the snow, and they learned that we plow. So they actually come down when it snows so that they don't have to stand in snow. So it's a real problem sometimes in the winter. As a side note, you can be late for school if a moose is in your driveway and you can't get out, and that's actually an okay excuse, because that happens. So when I came to Anchorage, and you talk about how you are curious, and remember the whole idea that I did all this because I'm curious, is I'm walking around all these large piles of moose scat, and they're like little nuggets. But when I mean piles, it's probably a 14-inch diameter. I mean, these huge piles, and we're all walking around them like they're no big deal. And I kept thinking, okay, I'm a micro person. There's got to be something, or there could be something. But everybody kept saying they were innocuous. There's nothing wrong with them. And and this is my first year here. I'm thinking, huh. So I had a handful of students. That was going to be winter break. And I go, so you guys are going to be bored over winter break? You want to do something? Because I was kind of curious. And so we collected some. Brown collected them. We put it in a thio broth, and I subcultured it. And oh my God, I couldn't believe what was growing. I mean, I couldn't believe the resistance we had. And so we did a small project, just me and these two other students. And I had already done CTI training for researching, because I wanted to make sure I brought research into the university. So I had all that taken care of, back to where you want to make sure that you get all your training, your ducks in a row. So when an opportunity happens, it's there. Because I didn't think anything was going to grow. So I knew this was a project. And so I conned these students into working with me all winter break, 40 hours a week, because I didn't know what it was, but I knew we had something. And it was the first paper that we actually sent, and we saw significant antimicrobial resistance. And at that time, I had microscan panels that had been donated with me, and we still use microscan. We use microscan for our IDs, but I like my Vitech for my breakpoints. I get better breakpoints. And my microscan panels were only for urine, because they just were donated to us. And so they've given us a good ID, but the urine's not the same antimicrobial susceptibility testing that I want to do. So anyways, but that's what we started out with. And even with that, I knew we were coming up with potential ESBLs because, of course, they were designed for, the cephalosporins and the breakpoints. And I'm like, oh my God. And I had the discs. So then we confirmed it with disc diffusion. And we're like, oh my God, we have ESBLs. I had no idea. So that's where it started. And so then I realized that we needed to create something. So that first year, I worked with a handful of students to develop at least some kind of protocol because nobody was doing it. I did some lit review over the next summer, and found out about some reindeer. And so then we started collecting moose, bear, and geese scat. It also became to my attention that we eat moose. I mean, we are a subsistent diet. And so I was concerned about enteric pathogens because no one tests for it because it's not a commodity. And that just lines right into enteric pathogens with our students. And so instead of doing any kind of mock-up, so the first year was the only year I did sort of pretend stools. After that, everything we did with stool samples we were collecting. We actually set them up. And as we were getting more information and I was getting more, things were coming out, then the hospitals really recognized the importance. So we were getting lots of good donated media. I was getting some funding from the university. And so we were constantly coming up with different ways to do things and making sure we were consistent and validating. And so what we found is a significant amount of antimicrobial resistance mostly in different ones for different populations. Because again, we do moose, bear, and geese. We have significant changes in antimicrobial resistance. So it's become a survey, which is really important. So we collect samples in the spring, collect moose samples in the spring, and then we keep them frozen. And then we analyze them the following year. So it kind of mimic the Alaska environment. So it's frozen and then it thaws in a moist environment, what grows. And so for us, it's not so important what grows, but often the only thing that grows. So the concept of mixed flora becomes really apparent to the students. So here we have a stool sample and the idea of mixed and sterile. And I mean, I'm telling you, they learn so much about cultures because we're doing things that are actual real samples. So yeah, tremendous amount of antimicrobial resistance right now, at least for moose. And of course, it's a little different. And again, I could do an entire podcast on this and my results. But as just some broad aspects, 71% of any moose scat that you would approach pile in the Anchorage Bowl area has one or more multi-drug resistant microorganism that you would isolate from that sample. 71%. And I had a student that did a really good deal because we were collecting, and we had all this data. And so she actually mapped it all. And we don't know how many moose are doing this. We don't really care. It could be one typhoid Mary moose that's defecating everywhere. But what we look at is high impact areas of human and animal interaction. So areas where we have unsecured camping, homeless, recreation, wherever we could have that. And so she mapped that out and found out it didn't even matter, statistically speaking, where in Anchorage you were. So in other words, whether you were along the creek beds, you were just as higher risk as if you were in some of the residential areas, which I thought was really important data to come with. And so that was I had a student, a departmental honor student, and that was one of her projects. She did some of, because we've gotten enough numbers. We've analyzed over 350 moose samples and all my students do it in class. Nobody gets out of doing research. Every student does it.
Oh, I love this, and we'll definitely, I'll reach out, and I will love to hear more about this in detail. So if you're willing to come back and talk about it, I will definitely be very happy to have you and chat some more about that.
Yeah, because we do it under the One Health model, and I'd really like to talk about the One Health model. I'm going to be speaking at the ASCLS conference under the One Health, the concept of One Health. I think it's, the idea that we're not the end of everything, that it's us and animals and environment. And I think healthcare has come a little bit slower to the table when we talk about One Health, and our research is actually the One Health model. And so I think it's, so if people are interested or listening to this, if you come to the ASCLS conference in Pittsburgh, I'll be speaking. I was on Tuesday, but I think they changed my day. They had to move me. But anyway, so I am speaking. So please come, or virtually, please come, and you'll listen a little bit, and you'll hear a little bit more about our research, but also why our research is so important and so impactful in our health when it comes to microbiology. And then if anyone is going to the ASM conference, we are also speaking at ASM, but it's more on our targeted, because we're also finding carbenopace producing microorganisms. And so every one of classification, so E. coli, Citrobacter, Hafnia, Actinobacter, and my head, I'm so bad. And Klebsiella. So all those classifications, we have every one of those. We have isolated one that was not only an ESBL, but also was a carbenopaste. And so that's all I'll be speaking about is our carbon. And that's a change over time. So we did not find a carbenopaste producing E. coli until last year. So that's not something that we saw in the beginning. So we have a trend that we're seeing of resistance, and we're talking about moose scat. We're not talking about human samples. We're just talking about moose scat that we're collecting in the Anchorage Bowl area since 2018. And so I'll be speaking on that at the ASM conference in Atlanta. So if you're anyone happening, you need to go to the ASM conference, I'll be speaking there also. So we're getting the word out. Our little research program from the Medical Laboratory Science Project department, which I think is pretty cool, right? I mean, MLS, way to go, right? We're doing cutting edge research in our program.
I love it. And definitely for the listeners, if you attend any of those conferences, and I told the audience, I'll be attending Microbe this year, and I'm participating in 2 events. So I'll definitely make sure that look you up and listen to yours. Well, Grace, this has been so great, and I love what you're doing with the students. And right, this is especially when it comes to microbiology. There's so much information, and it seems like you're preparing them, and it's definitely. I always talk about this and knowing your biochemicals, and sometimes we get all these new instruments and all this technology, and we might become a little too reliant on it. So we should definitely build that knowledge, and like I always like to say, by the time you're putting it on the instrument, you pretty much have a really good idea what you have, and you're just proceeding to prove it. Sometimes, as you said, if it's not on the database, you can get a weird ID. And so it's always very important to do things like your gram stain. And sometimes, you get some organisms, they don't grow McConkey. So don't assume that they're not gram negative and things like that can lead you to make some serious mistakes. So those basic and knowing your biochemicals, your gram stains and things like that definitely help you when you're making your determination. So as we're getting ready to wrap up the episode, as I said, I'm taking a lot of your time, but is there anything else that you want to tell the audience?
Well, for one thing is that as young people, if you're listening to this, you don't have to have everything figured out, at 23 or at 30 or at 35. If you are always keeping yourself open to new ideas, I think I read somewhere where, the year of saying yes. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to say yes to everything, but sometimes when an opportunity comes, and even though it may be out of your comfort zone, saying yes might open doors to an avenue that you never expected, stretches you farther than you have. And every time that you say yes to something, you grow. And so the next time it won't be maybe quite so scary to say yes. Had I not, moved to South Dakota and then moved to Kansas and, and done some things, it would have been harder to move to Alaska. So even though it sometimes seems when you're a MLS student and you do a rotation at a hospital and you're comfortable and then they hire you there, it just seems such an easy thing to do. And yet I want to tell you, sometimes when you're young, try to stretch yourself a little bit every time that opportunity comes, because then when other opportunities come when you're older, it might be easier to make that move. Or sometimes when they're put upon you and you have no choice, but you have built this ability to stretch a little bit out of your comfort zone, even something as minor as, okay, yeah, I'll be the lead on this instrument. I mean, it doesn't have to be that you make this huge move, but every time you do something, even as little as that, it prepares you for when you might have to, because you might have to make a bigger leap, but you'll have that foundation. So don't be afraid to say yes, because otherwise, I told my students, if I did everything I said I was going to be, I'd have been a nun working in argon labs in Chicago. So, life doesn't always work that way. And by letting yourself, like I said, stretch yourself, it's a good thing to do. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just take those chances, when measured chances. And then, of course, as my husband say, gotta have a backup. And if you can't have a backup for the backup, you always have that plan B. And when I was moving to Alaska, and it was really scary. It was scary. I was leaving my house, a job of 35 years. This was not an easy move, okay? And we're moving across in a pickup truck across Canada for 7 days. It took us 7 days to move across Canada. And I didn't know. And then my husband left me because he had the farm. So he dumps me in Alaska, and then he leaves me, for the first 6 weeks, right? And it was scary. But I remember my one daughter goes, "Oh, Mom, I'm sure they could use you to work second shift blood bank at Providence Hospital if it really is bad. This really is not what you want to do. If you really have to bail, you have that backup plan. Remember, Mom, that backup plan. You've got those skills, right? Like, yeah. Because well, you've got that, then go ahead, try. What's the worst that can happen? You're going to be working night shift at Prov until next year or whatever. And so that also helps. So saying yes and then always recognizing you got a backup plan. And if your backup plan, that's okay, then just take that leap. Because what's the worst that can happen, right?
Yeah, that's wonderfully said. So, once again, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. And as I said to the audience, if you're make sure that if you're attending Microbe this year, look up our talks, and I'm definitely looking forward to meeting people and attending some great events. This conferences, they're really great, and I always encourage people to, if they have the chance to attend them, to go ahead and do so. So once again, Grace, thank you so much for taking the time to being on Let's Talk Micro.
It's been a pleasure for me too.
And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy learning about the MLS program at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. What a great educator. I love what she's doing with the students, how she's preparing them, her way of thinking about knowing about the biochemicals and the organisms. And sometimes, we become too complacent with technology. And as microbiologists, we need to know the organisms, their reactions. Sometimes organisms are not in the database of instruments. Things can go wrong. I have spoken about this many times. So it is good to build a solid foundation. So it was so great listening to her. And she's going to be at ASM Microbe this year in Atlanta. So if you're planning on attending, look her up in the schedule, check her talk, and go listen and attend it. I'm planning on doing that and meeting her in person as well. And if I see you in Microbe, say hi. I'm looking forward to meeting you. Thank you so much for the support. Recently, the podcast celebrated its 3rd year. So, thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading episodes. And stay tuned. Great things coming your way. Please continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. You do such great work. So, as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.